Story 1. The Silence in the Shadows. I always thought that things like this only happened in horror movies or sensationalist news reports, but I never imagined that I myself would be the protagonist of one of these macabre tales. It all started so subtly that, at first, I didn't even notice it. It was a typical afternoon in New York. I had just gotten off work and, as usual, stopped by the coffee shop on the corner to get a cappuccino. While I was waiting in line, I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I didn't think much of it. I thought it was just the very cold air conditioning or maybe some accumulated nervousness from the day at work. After a few days, I started to notice something strange. Every time I left work, a man seemed to be nearby. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. New York is a big city with millions of people, so seeing someone repeatedly can happen. But he was there with disturbing frequency, and I started to feel uneasy. One day, when I left early, I decided to take a walk down a different path. To my surprise, there he was, leaning against a lamppost, looking at me with an enigmatic smile. My heart raced, and the feeling of fear began to become constant. I started walking faster, looking away and pretending to be distracted by my cell phone. Even so, I felt his gaze fixed on me until I turned the corner and he disappeared from view. In the weeks that followed, he became a constant presence in my life. I saw him everywhere, in the entrance of my building, in the grocery store, even at the gym. He never approached me, never said anything, but his piercing gaze made me more and more frightened. I told my friends about him, but many said that I was exaggerating, that it must have just been a misunderstanding. But I knew something was wrong. My intuition was screaming at me to be careful. One night, when I returned home, I found a note on the door of my apartment. "You can't run away from me," he said in shaky handwriting. My heart almost stopped. I called the police, but without any concrete evidence or witnesses, they said there was little they could do. I was trapped in a nightmare. I started taking precautions. I changed my routines, avoided common places, always looked over my shoulder. But he always found me. Fear became my constant companion. The final straw was when, one morning, I woke up with a strange feeling. I went to the window and, down below, on the deserted street, he was standing, staring at my apartment. An overwhelming panic took over me. I closed all the curtains, locked the doors and spent the rest of the night awake, holding a kitchen knife. Finally, I decided to move to another city. I left my job, my friends and everything I knew. I thought that would give me peace. But even now, in a new city, I still feel like I'm being watched. The fear has never gone away, and maybe it never will. Because once you are targeted by a stalker, the shadow of fear becomes a part of you. Story 2. The Night Visitor. It was a warm summer night in Los Angeles, and I was walking home from a party with friends. The city was alive, with lights twinkling and the distant sound of music echoing through the streets. I loved LA for that. There was always something going on, a constant energy that made anything seem possible. I lived in an apartment on the third floor of an old but charming building. When I arrived, I noticed that the front door was ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I had locked it before I left. Cautiously, I pushed the door open and walked in. Everything seemed to be in its place, nothing of value missing. I convinced myself that perhaps it had been my carelessness and locked the door again, trying to ignore the feeling of unease. Over the next few nights, I began to notice strange things. Small objects out of place, a constant feeling that I was being watched. I had a cat, Felix, who also seemed restless, his eyes always fixed on empty corners of the room. I thought I was becoming paranoid, so I installed a few security cameras in my apartment to put my mind at ease. One night, as I reviewed the footage, my blood ran cold. There he was, an ordinary-looking man, standing in the living room, watching me as I slept on the couch. He didn't touch anything, didn't move, just stood there, silently, watching me. I turned off the video, my heart pounding wildly. I called the police, but again, with no evidence of a break-in other than the video, there was little they could do. I decided I needed professional help and hired a private investigator. He installed more sophisticated equipment and began monitoring my apartment. A few weeks passed without incident, and I began to relax, thinking that maybe he had left. Then, one stormy night, I woke up to a noise coming from the living room. My heart raced, and I grabbed my cell phone, ready to call the police. With quiet steps, I walked to the bedroom door and peered through the crack. There he was again, standing in the middle of the room, drenched in rain, watching me. I screamed and he ran, disappearing before I could do anything. The police arrived quickly this time, but he had already disappeared without a trace. My investigator reviewed the recordings and discovered that he had a pattern, only appearing on rainy nights. I was terrified, living each day in fear of the next storm. Finally, I decided to leave town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, I just disappeared. But even now, in a new city, every time it rains, I feel that old fear returning. And sometimes I get the feeling that it's still nearby, waiting in the shadow of the next storm. Story 3: The Stranger in the Window. It all started when I moved to a small town in the Oregon countryside. I wanted a quiet place to write my next book and found a charming house on the edge of a lake, perfect for the inspiration I needed. At first, it was everything I dreamed of: peace, nature, and time to dedicate to my writing. But the tranquility was short-lived. One night, while I was working late, I heard a noise coming from the living room window. It was a subtle sound, like someone was scraping something on the glass. I went over to it, but saw nothing but darkness. I thought it might be an animal and went back to work. The noise continued for the next few nights. I was starting to get nervous, but I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. Until one night, I decided to leave the porch light on to see if I could catch whoever was making the noise. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. Slowly, I walked over to the window and, to my horror, I saw a face watching me from outside. I screamed and the figure disappeared into the darkness. My heart was pounding, and I knew I needed help. I called the police, who patrolled the area but couldn't find anyone. They said it was probably a curious local, but I knew it wasn't that simple. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I installed security cameras around the house and began locking all the windows and doors more carefully. But that didn't stop the stalker. One night, when I was reviewing the footage, I saw the same figure standing outside the window, watching me for hours, without moving. Fear became a constant in my life. I decided to change my routine, writing during the day and trying to sleep at night, but always with a knife next to my bed. The tension was consuming me. Then, one morning, I woke up to a loud noise. I ran to the living room and found the window broken. The stalker had finally broken into my house. I called the police and locked myself in the bedroom, shaking with fear. They arrived quickly, but the intruder had already fled. With the help of the police, I was able to install a more robust security system and an alarm. But even so, I decided that I could no longer live there. I sold the house and moved back to the big city, hoping that the stalker would not follow me. To this day, however, when I am alone at home and hear a strange noise, my heart races, and the memory of that face in the window comes back to haunt me. Story 4: The Unknown Call. I always enjoyed working late at the university library. It was a quiet place, with few distractions, perfect for my studies. But everything changed when I started receiving calls from an unknown number. At first, they were just silent calls. I would answer and hear nothing on the other end. I thought it was a misdialing or a prank call and ignored it. But the calls started to become more frequent, always at the same time, around 10 p.m., when I was alone in the library. One night, while I was reviewing my notes, the phone rang again. I answered, expecting more silence, but this time, a hoarse voice whispered, "I see you." My heart raced, and I hung up immediately. I looked around, but saw no one. The library was empty. The calls continued over the next few days, always with the same message. I began to become paranoid, looking over my shoulder and avoiding being alone. I told one of the security guards at the university, but he said it was probably just some student playing around. One night, as I was leaving the library, I realized I was being followed. I picked up my pace, but the person was still right behind me. Finally, I turned around and saw no one. My heart was racing, and I decided I couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. I installed a call tracking app on my phone, hoping to find out who the stalker was. That's how I discovered that the calls were coming from a payphone near the library. With this information, I went to the police, but they said that without solid evidence, it was hard to do anything. They advised me to be cautious and to avoid being alone at night. One night, as I was walking to my car in the empty parking lot, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly and saw a hooded figure. I ran to my car, got in, and locked the doors. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. I called the police and they arrived quickly, but the stalker had already disappeared. They escorted me home and advised me to be more careful. I decided to change my routine and avoid the library at night. But the feeling of being watched never went away. To this day, whenever I receive a call from an unknown number, my heart races, and the memory of that disturbing whisper comes back to haunt me.